Hello and welcome to my channel. This morning as I was preparing my breakfast, I was listening to a debate with Sargon and Akkad and Christine Winters on whether feminism is good for the galaxy. And I then left to play 9 holes of golf with my dad, came home, did some work in the yard, took a nap, woke up, and listened to Sargon's reflection on the same. And I just had a couple of thoughts I wanted to add where I think maybe in terms of the debate, what I think Sargon might have improved, what he might have gotten wrong, or what might have been helpful for him to have considered in going into such a debate. And what I thought overall of not just who won the debate, but maybe who won the argument. So let's get started. So before I want to begin, just a couple of things I wanted to bring up that clearly, even though I call myself the over-underthinker because sometimes I overthink things and sometimes I underthink things, this clearly is a little bit of an underthink in that, you know, I listened to it, I did other things, which is why I told you my schedule, what happened in my day, and then came back to it. And so I haven't really pondered it, thought of all the implications, and maybe today, tomorrow, next day I might feel differently about some aspects, but this is just kind of where I'm at on it. Here's some of the things that jumped out at me that I thought maybe Sargon should have taken into account a little bit more. And the first one has to do with the nature of feminism itself. I think it's very difficult to enter any debate about feminism as a thing, because feminism, to some degree, is really not a thing, or at least not a consistent, concise thing. To give you an example, to me, I think feminism, in dealing with it, is a lot like having discussions about Hamas. Hamas is the, Palestinian group that has several wings to it, right? They have a social service wing called Dawa or something like that. A military wing is al-Din al-Qassam brigades, and a political wing which is I think they're governing Gaza right now. I don't really know. I bet you if you look up Hamas in Wikipedia, you can read all that. But the important part is they have different groups that are all Hamas that do entirely different things. And when they criticize them and they say, oh, Hamas, they are all terrorists, they say, no, we have our social service wing, and they go and they feed the hungry and they help people dig out of the rubble and put their houses back up, which is why they got political power, which then they use to govern. And then they have a separate military wing which does some of the more violent aspects of Hamas's strategy. But they're all Hamas. And in Turkey, the PKK is kind of the same thing. They have a political wing, they have a military wing, they have a social service wing, and when Turks say, oh, the PKK, the Kurds, they're a bunch of terrorists, they go, no, look at all the good that we're doing. Now, I'm not saying that feminist is an Islamic terrorist group. I just use these as examples because they're clearly where you have one name or one group, but you have very different people with very different agendas. And I think feminism is a lot like that, which makes it very difficult to say whether feminism is a force for good or a force for evil or a force for anything, because it's not a group. It's usually a bunch of several groups that all use the same name. Now, the way that they're not like Hamas is there's no central leadership, there's no real organization. You know, it's more in some ways like the hashtag Gamergate movement, of which I'm sure Sargon is well aware. I remember listening to some of his videos where they were talking about how some people thought Gamergate was one thing and other people thought it should just be about, doing journalism the correct way, or as a consumer revolt kind of thing against corrupt journalism, and some people thought it should do all these other things now that we have the organization together. And I remember him having some level of frustration about that. But in the same way that nobody can control hashtag Gamergate, that it's not a thing, and the feminists and other anti-Gamergaters at the time were saying, hey, Gamergate's doing this, and they could go, well, this guy uses the hashtag Gamergate, but how can you say that it is Gamergate? It's kind of the same argument in reverse, right? So I think in some ways, feminism feels like it's not a thing. It's kind of like in the movie The Usual Suspects, where the cop says that Kaiser Sose is just a dodge that criminals do to create kind of, a presence, something that they don't have. The next kind of area I want to discuss deals with the rules of the debate, specifically where they said anything not cited could be refuted. If you cited it without having, if you said this is a fact without having citations, you can refute it without citations, right? So one of the things that would have been helpful for him to have, here's a list of feminists saying A, B, C, D, E. But I think what would have happened had he gone through the time to prepare that, it would have been tedious and eaten into his time, as well as she could have come back and say that she was not going to get in the head of another individual in the very same way as she said she did not want us to speak for President Obama when he quoted the figure 1 in 5 women getting raped on college campuses, right? The second thing was she actively used the question to avoid points that she wanted to by bringing up, this doesn't relate to the question that we're asking. However, her comments were not specifically linked always to that one particular question. And she used it all the way through as a dodge against anything that she didn't want to speak to, right? I do think she did have some good points when it came to social science methodology in general, but I would expect that because that's kind of her strong point, her bailiwick, But I think that some of those very same methodologies that she used, she applied to things that she used that to gain leverage in areas that maybe that leverage did not apply to. But that's just my opinion. There are a couple of things that I do think that Sargon did get right. I think that setting aside the issue of winning the debate, if that is a thing, I think that because of the way that he pressed her, we saw what she squirmed, or she used the rules, or that she used other things to try to avoid as well. At least I did. Like when I was watching, I felt like she worked really hard to avoid the issue that the FBI statistics did not jive with the 1 in 5 women raped on college campus study. And by the way, Sargon did, in his initial statement, point out and cite that the people who actually created the study did say not to use that study, and she purposefully talked past him to avoid having to speak to that point, and being on record, I think, as being against that as a bad statistic. I think she also squirmed away from anything related to social media comments. She pointed to all these people. There was no citation. He should have come up with a list, and that's a good point. But the fact that she went to that instead of actually speaking to that, I think it was good to illustrate that. And the third thing was that when she was talking about the good, and Sargon did bring up this point, she pointed to historical wins by first and second wave feminists, and less the good done by the social media age, or social media feminists, or third wave intersexual feminists, and brought up a couple of things about a very specific law, which was a good example, but didn't really point to a lot of things. Here's what feminists that we see are doing now. Here's what people are doing who may take on the mantle of feminists, but in a lot of those cases, you don't know that those people self-identify as feminists, and nobody knows that. They could have been people who cared about that one individual issue without regard to whether it had something to do with, women in a general sense, or about the changing of the definition of a rape law in an individual state. Those might be people who are just outraged by that individual circumstance and may not have any particular political or ideological bent. So when she's talking about, these are the things that feminists did in certain areas, number one, she had no citation that was done by any feminists. And number two, most of what she did actually cite the dumbest feminists were not done by feminists of her current generation. Well, I don't know what generation she's in, but in the last, say, I don't know, 10, 15 years from going forward. And I do think that Sargon did a good job of pointing out that, you're talking about what good feminism has done, not what good feminism is now. So in summary, I was really grateful this morning to actually listen to this debate. I think it did a lot of good for both sides of the argument. And I think that Christy Winters is to be commended for participating, and Sargon as well. Although, on some level, I see more of what he had to gain by participating than she did, so I will give her a little bit extra credit for showing up, where a lot of people in her situation would not have bothered. If I were to score it on points, I might have said, based upon the rules and what was going to be allowed and disallowed, I might give her credit for winning the debate. But in the larger sense, if you're talking about walking away and being convinced, I will say that I felt like Sargon kind of won the argument. And I always get the impression that to some degree that he's not trying to, fill out a scorecard and win 25-0 against feminists or something like that. I think he's not trying to win the debate, he's trying to win the argument. So I think for all the things that he may have gotten wrong during the course of this debate, we'll say, I think the thing that he got right was the most important thing. I think he was far more convincing, and I think her, in trying to win the debate, felt like she had a lot more to hide, even when she made good points. Anyway, that's my opinion, and I'm sure other people have others. I was also glad to see the reflections that Sargon had after the debate. I think it served him in good stead. It put some context to his thoughts as to some of the performance things. I think, for something that he doesn't do on the regular, I think he did a good job, like a formalized debate instead of a casual conversation. I think Christy Winters seemed like she probably was more comfortable with the debate style and kind of taking the rules into account and preparing for the rules specifically. And I think that she was intelligent, and I think that a lot of the things that she said about social science methodology, I think they rang true. And I think around the edges, some of her arguments started to ring false a little bit in my ears. But I think that she did a good job too. So I want to say, kudos to both. I hope that you guys show up and do something else similar in the future. I'm always happy to listen to it. But just wanted to give a little bit of feedback. And since I'm underthinking, then I'm clearly starting to go into ramble thinking. So I think I'll end here. Anyway, thanks guys. I appreciate the debate. It was a great start to my Saturday morning, and I wish you all the best.